Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you are viewing this webinar. Again, my name is Dave Nagel, and I'm really excited to share some information with my colleagues and friends in Rutherford County Schools. This webinar focuses on John Hattie's instructional feedback model. And for those of you that were with Dr. Jones and myself back in July, this was the session that we did at the end of the day when we put a lot of time and effort in. Folks were getting a little bit brain fatigued, which would be expected. It was getting a little warm in the room, so we certainly want to go back and review it just a piece. We're gonna touch base deeply on feedback again on our time together on August 30th. But if you weren't together with us, it's a chance to be introduced to Hattie's feedback model and hopefully look at how we could apply that right off the bat this school year as students come back to school in Rutherford County Schools. So I'm going to just jump right in with just a statement and quote from Dylan William and his work Inside the Black Box, that effective feedback can double the speed of learning. And I think all of us in education would sign up for anything that would double learning. And a key term here, though, is that it's effective feedback, not necessarily positive or negative. And so we're going to talk specifically in this webinar, as we will with all of our time in visible learning, is how do we monitor the effectiveness of the feedback, not in the delivery, but how we determine if it was received and then utilized. A little bit about myself, for those of you that by now might be familiar because of our time together or from the first webinar on mind frames. All my career has been in a building as a practitioner, as a secondary educator, but I've been doing presenting and consulting for 12 years and twice been fortunate to be certified in visible learning work. So I'm really excited to be able to share some of that information on a deeper level, both here on these webinars and when we're on site in Rutherford County. And trying to make any webinar as interactive as possible. Again, this is a recorded webinar, so we can't interact in real time with chat functions and things of that nature. But if you have a thought or a question, please email me at dave.nagel@corwinlearning.net. Or if you're a Twitter follower and you're involved in social media network in that way, please choose to follow me if you're interested at Dave Nagel VL+. So let's just jump right into the work today. We have 3 learning intentions for today's session. This is for me, sort of the instructor, to say this is what I want you as the learners to walk away with, to be able to describe how effective feedback really can double learning. How the instructional feedback model can drive learning, and it's based on where the learner is in the learning process. We're going to look at different types of feedback that we provide students or any learner based on where they are, and then talk briefly at the end about the importance of relational trust with both the staff but also the students, so that way feedback can be effective because we have a safe culture for feedback. As the learners, as the participants, you'll know you've met the learning intentions when you can complete these 2 success criteria. You could articulate the 4 types of feedback, 3 of which that are part of the instructional model, and determine an action step to move forward using Hattie's instructional model for feedback to drive student learning. And again, when we say effective feedback doubles the speed of learning, I've got a slight issue on the formatting on this slide, but the typical effect size for all learners is 0.4. Feedback comes in at about 0.75. So the average of all the feedback studies, when there's been as many as any, there hasn't been a influence studied more than feedback by John Hattie and his colleagues at Cognition. And if the average is at 0.75, think about how often feedback is well above that. So effective feedback easily can double the speed of learning because the average effect would be 0.4. This webinar will be just a little bit different. I have the reflective handout that I've sent to Trey that would accompany this webinar. And there's a couple times for some activity. So activity 1, I'm just going to ask you to pause the recording and take a moment. And if you're by yourself, it's, you can still do the activity, but certainly if you're in a group, it's even more powerful. But take a moment and describe a time in your life when you received effective feedback. And be specific. Don't just say when these things happened, when I was in 5th grade, when I was in college, last week. Specifically describe what happened. What was the feedback? Was it verbal or written? And what was the outcome? And then do the same thing for ineffective feedback, times when you received it specifically and how it wasn't effective. And I really want to phrase effective meant it improved your performance. Not on how it made you feel, but it improved your performance one way or the other, or it did not improve your performance. I'm going to pause briefly, but I'm going to encourage you to pause the recording here for a few moments and complete the activity. Come back whenever you need to. Welcome back. I'm assuming that you've paused the recording and completed the activity. If you haven't, please do so. And just pause the recording as long as you need, and then come back when you've had a chance to not only complete the activity, but perhaps have some dialogue with your peers. Feedback is effective when it simply meets these criteria. It's just in time for me. It's the information that I need when it can do the most good. And a way to think about that is that effective feedback meets the Goldilocks principle. It's just in time for me. It's just right for me in the moment. And so we're going to dig into what's in the feedback box, what's in that term that we use, that there's a lot of studies and a lot of information, but what's really in there? And so second little activity, I'm going to ask the participants just to pause, and in your handout you see this brief summary of 7 statements related to effective feedback that Hattie cites throughout his large-scale synthesis of feedback research studies. Take a moment and pause the recording, and in your handout, just read through those 7 statements and reflect on which one resonates the most with you. Which one do you find the most interesting or compelling, and why? Again, just like last time, pause the recording, complete the brief activity, and certainly if you're in a PLC setting or a collaborative setting, please pause as long as you need to and have a dialogue with your peers. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back. If you didn't pause the recording, please do so now. Don't move on. Go ahead and complete this simple activity. It's quick and concise, but it often generates some really good dialogue. Obviously, we can't have back and forth dialogue right now, but very often folks will resonate to number 4, the 80-20 principle. And that comes from Graham Nuttall's research. He found in over 1,000 classroom observations that 80% of feedback students receive is actually from peers, and 80% of it is wrong. Now, the first time I heard that statement, I thought, well, we need to stop these kids from giving each other feedback. We can't. What we have to do is increase how they can give feedback in terms of the quality, and that relates to the success criteria. The more effective students understand the criteria, the more their feedback will be geared to what their peers should be learning about. Well, we had a glitch there with the slide. I apologize for that. We give our students great feedback. The question is, what do they hear? So one of the questions I often ask teachers is, do you give your students effective feedback that increases their learning? And it's a multiple choice item. And your choices are yes, no, or I'm not sure yet because I've never asked them. So the administrators, do your teachers receive effective feedback that improves their teaching and their craft? Same thing, yes, no, or I'm not sure yet because I haven't asked them. Delivering feedback isn't the same as knowing it was received. The purpose of feedback is always to close the gap, whatever that gap is. And that gap is from where we are in our current learning to reaching the success criteria. We provided some success criteria earlier, like when you will be able to articulate the 3 levels of instructional feedback that are part of the model. That's where I need to be. Then as a learner, I need to determine where I am right now in my learning, and feedback's job helps me close the gap. And any learner can receive feedback from 3 places in the classroom. They can receive feedback from the teacher, from their peers, or also from themselves. Think about how students give themselves feedback anytime they play PlayStation. They're constantly monitoring their own learning and providing feedback to get to the next level. We've all seen this on students' papers, maybe our own, and I'm going to take a moment, just in case you haven't noticed, check out how the word trying was spelled. We have to be cautious in terms of thinking that feedback will ever be delivered and received at the same level. So I'm going to walk us through now the instructional model for feedback, a review for some and maybe an introduction for others, but we will provide task feedback for any learner who's new or emergent, usually with new material and usually correct or incorrect answers. You're getting your order of operations incorrect. I have to help you. You're messing up phenotype and genotype. You're messing up your feminine and masculine conjugation term, or your feminine and masculine terms in learning Spanish. It's new, and I'm going to help you with the correct or incorrectness early on. But once there's some degree of proficiency, we want to focus the feedback less on whether or not something is right or wrong, and more on how the learner is processing the strategies they used. So you got the last 4 problems right. What do you think is wrong with this one? I noticed the last 3 times you did your order of operations correctly. This time doesn't seem to be going as well. What do you think you did before? What could you do differently? Notice that I'm asking a question. Self-regulation feedback is when there's a high degree of proficiency, and I want the learner to begin to regulate their own learning. So for example, I hand a student a text and I say, this text is a little bit challenging. It's actually above your Lexile level. What 3 reading strategies do you think you're going to use? Notice what I did. I didn't say, here's a tough text and here's the strategies I want you to try. I said, it's challenging, but what do you think works for you best? I allowed the learner to determine where their path will go. Task, process, and self-regulation are part of the instructional feedback model. There is another kind of feedback. It's called self-feedback. We saw an example of it in the previous slide. You are not trying. Focusing on you, the learner. Also, praise. Great job. Attaboy. It's not that we want to eliminate praise, but we're very cautious. I'm going to talk through a couple of points using praise at the same time we're using instructional feedback. So I'm going to walk us through two examples, and the first one is a real life example. For those of you that are parents and you have or you're beginning to teach your children to drive, I'm still a few years away from that, but at some point in time I could imagine we might tell our learners who are learning how to drive a car, you need to look both ways before you enter traffic. It's specific. It's task oriented. It's correct or incorrect. Nothing personal, but you need to check both ways. It's good that you know that the left pedal does stop the car and that you slammed on the brakes to slow it down. That's actually good. Sarcasm is intentional. But I might ask my son, what else might you have been thinking about to lessen the likelihood of slipping on ice or slipping on slippery pavement? What do you think you could have done differently? Notice it's in the form of a question. Last few times we've gone out on the interstate, it was pretty limited traffic. It was Saturday morning. It was pretty empty. We're going out on rush hour traffic. What are some things you should be thinking about? Notice what I didn't do. I didn't say, well, it's going to be heavy traffic. You should need to 10 and 2, turn the radio off, fix your mirrors. I want the learner to regulate. I want him to be able to determine this. I want to see where he's going. But I'm allowing him a lot of freedom because certainly we wouldn't take a new driver out on the highway, especially during rush hour traffic. I don't think that last part is going to help Nick know what to do next. Let's look at a similar example in a math classroom. Horizontal axis is correct. We need to go back and look at the vertical one. I'm gearing him to that one specific thing. I'm fixing it early, letting him know what's wrong. I'm trying to get his surface level knowledge solid so he can move on. But now we've moved on in instruction. Oh, Chris, the last times you created your plot 4 times, you did it well. You're struggling this time with the spacing. What could you do differently? Notice I asked a question. I could say, here's a ruler. You can set it up that way. But I want him to think, since he's done it correctly before, there's no reason for me to give him the answer. And this is where, as teachers, we have to be cautious in not throwing the lifeline too soon with our learners that are at a certain degree of proficiency or approaching it. Another thing to think about, far too often when I mentioned the peer feedback earlier, is that we give our students the opportunity to provide peer feedback, but we don't empower them to help new learners. So it's not just that I want you to teach this to a new student, but what errors would you look for so you know where to help them? Don't just do it for them. Look for their errors. Diagnose. Another example at the top of praise. Great job plotting the axis. Doesn't really empower Chris to know what his next learning step would be. And so again, when we look at process or self-regulation, when we're asking questions, task is only when there's new learning. And so if there's one maybe takeaway is that we want to push ourselves out of task feedback maybe a little bit sooner than we do sometimes and not just give students the answers that they're either waiting for or make it a little bit easier for us because then they're not struggling as much. That struggle is something we have to embrace, and feedback is a way to do that. This is what you see in your working handout. You see the feedback summary chart that I provided. It's just some other simple examples that you can use when you're looking at task, process, or self-regulation feedback when, and then some prompts that might help you as you start the school year. And maybe you just fill in the blank or just add some elements to your specific content or subject matter. And again, any learner needs the feedback so it helps them know where to go next. A visible learner knows where they're going, how they're going, and where to next. The final piece related to the feedback model I want to share is around praise. And it's not that we want to eliminate praise, but we want to make it something that we don't apply to the product or performance. The exam, the test, the skills that we're asking them to demonstrate, there was a standard for those. We want to praise the effort, the resilience. That was a great effort. Let's see how you did. When learners hear, great job, but you actually made 4 mistakes, let's fix them, far too often, all they hear was the great job. Great effort, great ability to kind of persevere through that problem. Let's see if we have any mistakes. Notice the difference, acknowledging the effort, the process, not the product. And an interesting study by DeLuca and Summer, in industrialized nations like ours, we often prefer praise. And why we kind of know this is true, take a look at folks' Facebook pages. We like our stuff to be liked. In Confucian-based cultures, by default, they actually are offended by praise. They're more interested in telling them what's right or wrong about their work and their performance. So we know this is a challenge. We have students and parents and all of us. We like to be acknowledged, and sometimes we like to have bumper stickers on the car. We have to be very cautious in terms of what we are praising and save the praise separate from the instructional feedback, so we don't combine them and convolute the message. And last but not least, feedback has to be a two-way street. Children giving feedback to their teachers. And Hattie talks a little bit about a feedback and feed forward. Feedback is, here's what you might need to do to improve, and here's what you're doing well, and here's where your next learning step could be. Here's what will take you even further. The last piece, as I mentioned with our success criteria, is looking at that element of relational trust, the glue that holds the relationships together. Schneider's research was pretty profound in the Chicago Public School turnaround that in the early part of the first decade of the 2000s, the only schools that made huge gains in learning and achievement, the commonality was relational trust at the PLC level. It's critical that we have a system of trust where we can challenge each other as adults and give each other effective, critical feedback at times, because then we have a better chance to do so in the classroom. So we have to ask ourselves, is it our school a safe environment for feedback? And certainly it's not a Rutherford or a Tennessee issue, but sometimes schools live in the land of nice, and we want to be nice to everyone. We can still be kind, we can still have respect for others, but we need to be efficacious. So if I come to a PLC meeting and I show my assessment, I say, what do you guys think of my assessment on this new skill I'm going to do with my students? The default answer shouldn't be, hey, Dave, I think it looks great. It should be, well, let's look at it. I love you enough to tell you I'm not quite sure that lines up with what you were trying to find. And sometimes we're afraid to give that kind of honest, effective feedback because we're worried that someone's feelings will be hurt, or maybe they would give us that kind of feedback. But wouldn't we want it ourselves personally to be able to go, it's a great start, great effort, but I think you could improve it by doing this. So it's an important conversation we need to monitor as well. As always, I thank you so much for the opportunity to have a chance to share around these topics. I did highlight again from our first webinar the importance of the mind frames. When the mind frames are embedded, the 10 that Hattie notes, but there's 8 specifically in Visible Learning for Teachers, they really can empower effective feedback to happen more regularly and the culture improves. So I encourage you to look more there. Again, some of you I will see on August 30th. Some of you will be watching this webinar before or after. So either way, if you have a thought or a question, please send it to dave.nagel@corwinlearning.net. And please visit corwin.com and visiblelearningplus.com for more information on any of these topics. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.